All right, welcome back. This is part three. With this video, we'll probably end chapter two. After ending chapter two, we'll try to answer a few questions at the back of the book. Again, I also remind you that there's homework number two, which are even more questions from the back of the book. Those answers are to be uploaded at Ufle. And then one more lecture after this, I'll probably hold until next week. And then next week, we can talk about how the Philippines does it. And there are some interesting similarities and major differences as well. So, all right, so let's continue. The next part of this chapter is the components of expenditure. So recall that we started out with what the definition of GDP is: the market value of final goods and services produced within an economy in a given time period. And then we also learned that there's an income interpretation as well as an expenditure interpretation. So far, we've been looking at sort of an income interpretation or a production method interpretation. By the production method, we really mean the value added method, and that's how, in practice, GDP is computed. Now, there's this other side, which is expenditure. So you have income, and that has to equal total expenditure in an economy, right? All right, so here we go. So here are the components of expenditure. So GDP, or Y. By the way, GDP and Y, this should really be considered as real GDP. So you also talked about nominal versus real GDP. And whenever you see an equation like this, Y, where Y is alone, that's going to be real GDP. Meanwhile, P times Y, that is going to be our uh, variable for nominal GDP. Similar to this discussion we had here, wherein P times Y is nominal GDP. This is the GDP deflator, the percent change in Y, and Y here is real GDP, or the percent change in real GDP of percent change in Y. All right, so real GDP can be cut up into C, I, G, and NX. So the next question is what does that mean? So total income can be either a C, expenditure on the expenditure side. It can either be a C, an I, a G, or an NX. Okay, all right. The equation is an identity. So look at this, it's an identity, right? An equation that must hold because of the way the variables are defined. It's called the National Income Accounts Identity. Okay. All right. We can, well, we can look to the Philippines later. I was just thinking I should go to the Philippine side, but I will in a moment. Let's define C, I, G, and NX. So consumption consists of goods and services bought by households. So consumption is really about final goods and services bought by households. It's divided into three subcategories: non-durables, durables, and then services. Non-durable goods are goods that last only a short time and that they expire or they rot. Durable goods are goods that last a longer time, such as cars and televisions, and services include the work done for consumers by individuals and firms, such as haircuts and doctor's visits. Investment consists of goods bought for future use. So it's really not super clear what future use means. What this means is investment means an addition to capital. And capital is the factor of production that's used to produce future goods and goods in the future, I should say. And goods in the future can either be these consumption goods that you just talked about, or even investment goods also, right? So you can produce capital, can produce other capital, for instance. All right, so we have got three subcategories of investment. First is business fixed investment, residential fixed investment, and inventory investment. So business fixed investment is the purchase of new plant and equipment by firms. Residential investment is the purchase of new housing by households and landlords. And lastly, inventory investment is the increase in firms' inventories of goods. Okay, so these are the three big categories. I wanted in a future iteration of this course, I wanted to think a bit more about the Philippine situation when it comes to residential investment. In other countries, the wealth of a household, the majority of it is actually in terms of what land you own and what homes you own, or home you own, or homes if you have multiple. Some people invest in condos, right? And then rent them out. So a lot of the household wealth is tied up in real estate, in either land or housing. Okay. And the ability to accumulate this wealth is very important for generational wealth and for increased ability to invest in the future. So medyo mahalaga to, in my opinion, kind of understudied ang residential investment, buildings, and so on sa Pilipinas. And it's that understudied na wala masyadong information on it. So it's kind of hard to prepare a 101 course on it. Okay. Business fixed investment is sort of the easier one. So if you're running a business, you have to buy equipment. You have to buy also the factory, the office, the front office as well, and so on. So you can imagine all of these inputs, right, that you need to buy in order to produce your product. Okay. That's called business fixed investment. You're building capital for your business, right? And then finally is inventory investment. It's an increase in the firm's inventories of goods. So we talked about inventories earlier. If a firm produces some output not sold, they are essentially purchasing it for themselves and keeping it as inventory, and that will reflect an increase in I, right? So tumaas ang GDP when you produce and you keep it as investment. Or as inventory investment, I should say. Government purchases are final goods and services. What's irritating is the word final is not here, but it's understood. It's supposed to be final goods and services bought by federal, state, and local governments. The category includes military equipment, highway services provided by government workers. It does not include transfer payments to individuals, such as social security and welfare. Okay. Because transfer payments just reallocate existing income and are not made in exchange of goods and services. They are not part of GDP. So if there were an exchange, then it would be part of GDP if we are able to say impute, that was the word, impute the value of these services. We already spoke about how government purchases frequently need to be imputed because they're not technically exchanged in the market. They're provided by the government. Okay, so next, net exports. Okay, account for trade with other countries. Net exports are the value of goods and services, so both goods and services, sold to other countries. Those are exports. Okay, those are exports. Minus the value of goods and services that foreigners sell to us for inputs. So exports minus imports. Net exports are positive when the value of our exports is greater than the value of imports, and negative if it's the other way around. Net exports represent the net expenditure from abroad on our goods and services, which provides income for domestic producers. So this represents expenditure from abroad on our goods and services. So it's still part of expenditure. And what the sentence also says, that if it's part of expenditure on what the Philippines produced, then it's also going to be income for domestic producers. Okay. Now, what is investment? So again, we go back to investment. What is business fixed investment? An example is a confusing term, maybe investment. What it looks like for an investment for an individual might not be investment for the economy as a whole. The general rule is that the economy's investment does not include purchases that merely reallocate existing assets among different individuals. Investment, as macroeconomic economists use this term, creates new capital. So that's important, creates new capital. And it's not a mere reallocation. Suppose some examples. So let's consider some examples. Suppose we observe two events. Smith buys a 100-year-old Victorian house. So because it's a 100-year-old Victorian, we are assuming that it's an old house. It's not produced this year, right? And then Jones builds herself a brand new contemporary house. Okay, and by builds herself, what do you mean? Is you use the market to build it. Of course, you buy things, you buy contractors, and so on. What is the total investment here? 2 houses, 1 house, or 0? A macroeconomist seeing these 2 transactions counts only the Jones house as investment. Smith's transaction has not created new housing for the economy. It has just reallocated existing housing. Smith's purchase, meanwhile, Smith's purchase is investment for Smith. So from the idea of Smith here is you're buying this house and then you want it to appreciate, right? That's why it's called an investment for an individual person. The study of these kinds of decisions are called personal finance, right? And this is something that you may study in a finance course here in the School of Econ as well. However, it is disinvestment for the person selling this house from a macroeconomic point of view. So Smith wants to invest in it, right, to get this new house, but it's just a reallocation of this house from the previous owner to the new owner, and therefore nothing happens to GDP or aggregate investment. By contrast, Jones has added new housing to the economy. Her new house is counted as investment. Consider the following 2 events. Gates buys $5 million in IBM stock on New York Stock Exchange. General Motors sells 10 million in stock to the public and used the proceeds to build a new car factory. The second one is clearly investment, right? Because by selling the stock is able to use the proceeds to build new capital here. All right. In the first transaction, however, Gates is investing in IBM stock and Buffett is disinvesting. So there's a mere transfer of stock from Buffett to Gates, facilitated by the exchange, the New York Stock Exchange. So there is no aggregate new investment. So I hope that's clear. Shorthand, when it's investment, you're making something new, you're producing something new. And generally, that's also true for all GDP. It's recall the definition of GDP. You're producing new final goods and services within the economy in a given time period. Therefore, the previous time periods do not count, right? We've already talked about used goods, for instance. This is also very, very similar. So here in the case study, we stop and check out the components of GDP, right? In the United States in 2007, you've got 9,000 out of 13. 9.7 out of 30.8 is consumption. Investment is 2.1 out of 13.8. Government purchases is 2.6 out of 13.8. And then net exports here is negative, meaning that the United States imports more than it exports. We can use, so now I want to move to the Philippine case quite briefly. So at OpenStat, you can download this file or this version of GDP. So notice that this is gross national income and gross domestic product by expenditure shares. So since it's expenditure shares, it will have the following lines. Household final consumption, that relates to consumption. Government final consumption, which relates to government consumption, or G, right? Gross capital, and gross capital relates to I. Exports and then imports, this is the NX, exports minus imports. And then gross domestic product is here, which is the sum of all of these minus imports. So you could prove it to yourself, right, by checking this one. I am using the current prices, although you can use constant prices as well. So all you need to do is check if this is in fact real GDP. Is it equal to consumption, right, plus government spending plus investment plus exports minus imports. And as you can see, it's the same number, 3697756, and this is 3697756. So by construction, this is essentially the expenditure components of real and nominal up here, and real GDP down here. And then there's a long series. I think this one goes to 2023. Of course, hindi pa tapos ang 2024. That's why any 2024 data will be preliminary. All right, moving on. All right, so we'll see how alternative measures of income relate to one another to obtain gross national product, that's GNP. We will add receipts of factor income, okay? Receipts of factor income, wages, profit, rent from the rest of the world, and subtract payments of factor income to the rest of the world. So the difference in GNP and GDP is this gap between what you're earning from abroad, factor payments you're getting from abroad, and then you're subtracting factor payments you owe to people abroad. So an interpretation of GDP versus GNP is this: whereas GDP is total income produced domestically, so you have to produce it domestically in order to earn it. GNP measures the income by nationals or residents of a nation. And this income can be earned abroad. Right? An example, if a Japanese resident owns an apartment in New York, the rental income he earns is part of US GDP because it is earned in the United States. But because this rental income is a factor payment abroad, so basically he gets it, right? It becomes part of this minus factor payments to abroad. It's not part of US GNP, so you subtract that rent from US GNP. Okay. Of course, from the point of view of France, that is a factor payments from abroad. So that movement of that rental income, while it's a minus in the United States, it's going to be a plus in Japan. So the Japanese GNP will go up by that amount. In the United States, factor payments from abroad and factor payments to abroad are similar. So there's a difference between a big country like the United States, which has this almost net zero difference in net factor payments. In the Philippines, there is a fairly big difference in net factor payments, and that's because of I should say that's because of remittances, right? So remittances are part of this factor payments issue, right? And later when we go to open economy, so right now we're going to sort of table this one. And we're just at this point going to say that that's the difference between GNP and GDP, right? But as soon as we hit chapter 5, I believe, open economy, we will deal with balance of payments, because in the Philippines is a small open economy, and the fact that we have a positive current account or a negative current account matters greatly, and it's part of our sort of constraints when we're trying to manage our macro economy. So now we're going to skip a lot of this. And here, we'll go to seasonal adjustment. So because real GDP and other measures of income reflect how well the economy is performing, economists are interested in studying quarter-to-quarter fluctuation. And when you start to do so, a fact leaps out. All of these measures of income exhibit a seasonal pattern. The output rises during the year, reaching a peak in fourth quarter, then falling in the first quarter of the next year. So that's the seasonal adjustment. Over the year, tumataas yung quarterly GDP sa United States. These regular seasonal changes are substantial. From the fourth quarter to the first quarter, real GDP falls on average about 8%. So it's not surprising that real GDP follows this seasonal cycle. Some of these changes are attributable to changes in our ability to produce. For example, building homes is more difficult in cold weather. In addition, people have seasonal tastes. They have preferred times for some consumption activities, such as vacation and Christmas shopping. When economists study fluctuations in real GDP, When economists study fluctuations in real GDP and other economic variables, they'll want to eliminate the portion of fluctuations due to predictable seasonal changes. So you'll find most of the economic statistics reported are seasonally adjusted. So in the Philippines, quarterly data is available and seasonally adjusted quarterly data is also available. So now I wanted to show you guys the Philippines quarterly data. This is something also that you can download. So before showing you this graph, I will go here first. Okay. And here, this is a download again from OpenStat. This is gross domestic product expenditure shares, but this time quarterly. And what we wanted to show here is the quarterly behavior of real GDP. So first, is it true, like in the United States, GDP tends to rise throughout the year with a peak in the fourth quarter? So let's go here. So in this one, I have isolated several years of GDP, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2015. And here I have I have indicated here the quarterly GDP figures, and these are real GDP figures. So let us try to plot this using Excel. So this time we're using Excel and not R. So you can use any software that you have. Okay, so first, let's check out this chart. Okay, so the problem with this is that the columns are the ones that are the data points, so it's incorrect. So we have to actually correct this. So I'm going to, on the fly, do the series properly. So that's 2010. Next, 2011. Sorry. Let's go back to selecting the data. Then the next one is 2012. Nope, sorry. The next one is 2012. This next one is 2013. And then let's add another one for 2014, not 2015. So here's what you've got. By the way, this is 2014, not 2015. Just make sure. Okay, so what you've got here, and you can change the chart title, of course. This is quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four. We have something a little different than United States. In our case, we have increasing, decreasing, then increasing. That is our seasonal adjustment. Okay. That's true for all the years, and this is basically a ranked in order of years, right? Because over time, GDP is growing. So at each point, and this is something interesting, at each point, right, quarterly GDP is always going to be less than the next year's quarterly GDP. In green, and then the highest one is the 2014 one. So there's no overlap. And the reason why is because GDP is growing over time for all quarters, right? So you can calculate a quarter-on-quarter growth rate, basically, right? What's the next one? So what we want to do is to maybe check out the deviation of each quarterly data point from the average for the year. So here I've calculated the average per year. And as you can see, the average per year is going up, right? From 279. Actually, this is 2.79 million. It's actually in billions, I think, right? The units, I'm not sure. I think it's in either it's either hundreds of billions or already in trillion. So what is this? 279 until 352. So it's a fairly big change in 4 years. Makes sense. We can then get the mean and then subtract the mean from these values. So these values will be deviations from the mean. Hopefully you've taken some statistics so you know what a deviation means. So a deviation is, just look at this. It's the value of the quarter. So this is quarter 2 deviation from the mean divided by the value of the mean. And what this is saying is that first quarter, you have deviations on the order of 6%. 5.5 na yung pinakamaliit. Quarter 2, it's growing from the mean relative to the mean by about 2%, 2.5%. Quarter 3, it will fall from the mean again by 3 to 4%. And then finally, around Christmas time, fourth quarter, it's gonna shoot back up relative to the mean by 7%. And this is sort of the chart, right? What you notice here, of course, is that relative to the mean, the ordering of the years is now not in order, basically. This is 2010, and dark blue is not necessarily at the bottom, right? And then I'm just gonna move the state, the state of this one. The zoom thing. The light green one is 2012, and 2012 happens to be the largest quarter 4 increase amongst the 5 years being measured here. So if you're looking at quarter-on-quarter percent changes, percent deviation changes, then of course the rankings will not be different, and then you can come up with sort of regularities based on for example, if your first quarter is really a big negative here, then at some point babawiin mo yun. At some point, if the light green is the lowest here, then it has to be the highest here. Okay. Because it's all relative to the mean, right? Mean for that year. A lot of this is very interesting time series stuff. And when you study econometrics time series, you'll realize that you can measure and control for this quarterly effect here, or you can directly go for the seasonally adjusted real GDP in quarters. All right, but that's for the future. That's something for you to think about, and something that I don't know if you've noticed that a lot of people who haven't seen the actual data have noticed that there's this strong seasonal variation in real GDP in the Philippines. And I advise you guys to do the same thing or something similar, downloading the actual data set and checking out what the regularities in Philippine quarterly real GDP. Okay. All right, so that ends the discussion on ManQ when it comes to real GDP. We will return to real GDP next video because we'll talk about how the Philippines does it and the big differences between how ManQ presents the United States method and how the Philippines has to do it. So the Philippines has a few restrictions that the United States does not have. Our next big macro stat is Consumer Price Index. And this measures the cost of living. And part of this is also inflation. So $1 today doesn't buy as much as it did 20 years ago. The cost of everything has gone up. The increase in the overall price levels is called inflation. It's one of the primary concerns of economists and policymakers. Here we discuss how economists measure changes in this cost of living. So how do we do that? We have a basket of goods, right? as defined by or in the Consumer Price Index. So you have a Consumer Price Index that the Philippine Statistics Authority is also computing. It begins by collecting prices of hundreds, thousands of goods. Yes, same. Just as the GDP turns quantities of many goods into a single number, measuring the value of production, the CPI turns the prices of many goods into a single index, measuring overall level of prices. Okay. So instead of simply computing an average of all prices, you can see how that might be wrong because you would treat all goods and services equally, right? An average is just you add up everything and you divide it by the number of prices. Clearly, that would mean that high-priced goods would affect the average, yeah? So you might not want that. Because people buy more chickens than caviar, the price of chicken should have a greater weight in the CPI. So the CPI is the price of a basket of goods and services relative to the price of the same basket in some base year. In other words, the statistical agency has to define a statistical consumption basket, and then it's based on that basket where you decide where now you investigate how much are the costs of each component of the basket, and that's what you aggregate to get your consumer price index. The exact computation we'll be talking about in just a moment, but at this point here, you should see a sort of similarity between the CPI and the GDP deflator, right? In the sense that if you take a look at the denominator and the numerator, they both look super similar to nominal versus real GDP, except in CPI, these fives, these twos, these fives and twos, those are the quantities. So in real GDP, it's the quantity that moves, and you're keeping the price at the base level, right? But in CPI, you're interested in the prices. So what we're trying to do here is we're keeping the basket constant. So the basket in the numerator is 5 for apples, denominator is 5, it's 2 for oranges, and 2 in the denominator. So you're fixing the basket in CPI. As opposed to real GDP, you are fixing the prices, right, to be equal to the base period prices. In this one, you're fixing the quantities, and you're letting the prices change over time. So the denominator, you can say, is the base year, essentially real GDP, right? If 5 is the amount of apples that are consumed or purchased, then you multiply that with a 2009 price of apples, and then 2 is the consumption for oranges, then you multiply that with a 2009 price of oranges, and therefore you get that value, okay, in the denominator, which you could think about as equivalent to the real or nominal GDP, assuming, of course, you only have 2 products, right? Apples and oranges, and they're both final goods. Simplified assumption. The numerator, though, changes the prices, but keeps the basket at 2 and 5. Okay. So in this CPI, 2009 is what's called the base year. The index tells us how much it costs now to buy 5 apples and 2 oranges, that's the basket, relative to how much it cost to buy the same basket in 2009. So as you can see, pag tumaas yung price ng apples or oranges, the CPI will also go up. The Consumer Price Index is the most closely watched index of prices, but it's not the only one. There's also a Producer Price Index. Okay, the Philippines also has this. We also have a Wholesale Price Index. Another statistic, sometimes called core inflation, measures the increase in price of a consumer basket that excludes food and energy products. Because food and energy exhibit substantial short-run price volatility. So core inflation is sometimes viewed as a better gauge on ongoing trends in inflation. So one message here, spoiler alert for next video, it's correct. All of these things are also true in the Philippines, right? And we'll go through some more specific examples for the Philippine case, including what might be in the Philippine CPI basket. Okay, so here we have an interesting conceptual difference. As you can see, there's this relationship or similarity between the CPI and the GDP deflator. Okay, so what are the differences? I mean, in terms of just writing down the formula, it's price times quantity, right? And then the denominator would have the real one, right? The real GDP, and the numerator would have the nominal GDP. In a sense, the CPI would have as the denominator the base or the real basket, and then the numerator would be like the nominal basket because the prices are changing, but you're fixing. Anyway, so that's the CPI versus GDP deflator, right? The first difference between the two, however, is that the GDP deflator measures the prices of all goods and services, whereas the CPI measures only the ones in the basket, the ones bought by consumers. Okay, so that's how the PSA and Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, does it, right? That looks at the most commonly purchased products, and that is how they bill the basket, right? Whereas the GDP deflator tends to include other things like investment, government consumption. It's only in the stylized example of the only products we've got in the economy are apples and oranges, wherein they're similar in the sense of the number of products. So generally, GDP deflator has a broader look at the economy, looks at all of the products, all of the final products. Whereas CPI really looks at household consumption products. The second difference is the GDP deflator includes only those produced domestically. Imported goods are not part of GDP. However, an increase in the price of Toyota made in Japan and sold in this country affects CPI because the CPI does not differentiate between imported consumption and domestic consumption. The third and possibly subtle difference results in the way that they aggregate the prices. So CPI assigns the fixed weight. So this is important. If you notice that in the earlier equation here, the weights are the quantities, 5 and 2, 5 and 2. So the basket is constant, right? It's of course updated from time to time, but in any given comparison, when you're downloading data from PSA, they are fixing the basket. All right. Whereas the GDP deflator assigns changing weights, right? GDP deflator assigns changing weights. Because the quantities change, because the GDP deflator is based on the gap between nominal GDP and real GDP. And in either situation, real quantities are changing. So it's the weights that are changing. In other words, CPI is computed using a fixed basket, whereas the GDP deflator allows the basket to change over time as the composition of GDP changes. So you can imagine, okay, a situation where the CPI, because it has a fixed basket, it can overstate the amount of inflation. Because typically when prices of some goods go up, you will substitute towards a substitute. And therefore, the weights should really change depending on what's going on with the quantities, yes? So the GDP deflator then, or any sort of index that allows for changing quantity weights might be better. However, even the GDP deflator has its own flaws, even as the GDP deflator allows the baskets of goods to change over time. In this case, the GDP deflator might understate the actual welfare costs of inflation. Where does it stay here? The quantity, in other words, CPI, let me just find the sentence. GDP deflator allows the basket of goods to change over time as the composition of GDP changes. Here. So let's say that there is a change in the orange crop, right? A frost, so a lot of the orange crop goes away. There's a supply shock. Prices for oranges goes up. In a fixed basket, assuming that oranges are in the basket, because the quantity of oranges doesn't change, this will tend to overstate CPI. However, Because oranges become a smaller part, may not be even no longer part of GDP, the increase in the price of oranges does not show up in the GDP deflator. But because the CPI is computed with a fixed basket of goods that includes oranges, the increase in the price of oranges causes a substantial increase in the CPI. Now, here's a conceptual check. Economists call a price index with a fixed basket of goods. This is the CPI. That's a Laspeyres index, Laspeyres. And a price index with a changing basket is called PASCI. Economic theorists have studied the properties of these different types of indices. Turns out that neither is superior. So, here's the sentence I was looking for. When the prices of different goods are changing, the fixed or the Spiney's basket tends to overstate the cost of living because it does not take into account substitution. It does not take into account the opportunity to substitute. By contrast, a changing basket tends to understate the increase in the cost of living. Although it accounts for the substitution of alternative goods, it does not reflect the reduction in consumers' welfare that may result in such substitutions. Okay, in other words, remember that example of the orange shock. If the oranges suddenly stop being available, your GDP deflator will not really change. However, there are people who sort of will miss and will get hurt by the fact that oranges are not there anymore, not available. And therefore, it's not that welfare effect, right, is not going to be reflected. So one of the things that's not being perhaps totally clear here is that the CPI, or cost of living, should really also track the welfare of the people who are confronted with the changes in prices. And typically a higher CPI is an indication that welfare has gone down. In this case, in the GDP deflator case, GDP deflator does not go up by a lot because of the changing weights. In fact, almost zero oranges, but still, you can imagine some people are hurt by that. So you can imagine there has to be some kind of adjustment that increases the GDP deflator, even though oranges are no longer part of the basket within the GDP deflator because people have substituted away or there's no production of oranges anymore. So one interesting thing maybe we can do in class is to look at the difference between the GDP deflator and the CPI. Okay, so that's something to do. That's not homework yet. Maybe that's something we can do maybe later on in another chapter. Or maybe for the midterm, something like that. All right, now we are in the final part of ManQ, measuring joblessness or the unemployment rate. So similarly to the United States, the BLS, they measure the unemployment rate using a household survey. We have the labor force survey. And from here, we get the following sort of ancillary statistics. First, employed, the number of employed, the number of unemployed, and those not in the labor force. The Philippines has an additional, well, actually two. First, it's called underemployed, right? Underemployed. I will talk about the definition of underemployed when we get there, when we talk about the Philippine case. There's also the visibly unemployed. Okay, so in the Philippines, because of the nature of the Philippine economy, we have these other kinds of unemployment statistics that are necessary to compute. But in order to understand all of that, you do the basic stuff first, which is employed, unemployed, and not in labor force. So let's start defining these things. So the labor force is defined as the sum of the employed and unemployed. The unemployment rate is defined as the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. That means labor force is the sum of employed and number of unemployed. And unemployment rate is simply the number of unemployed divided by labor force. The labor force participation rate, which is something the Philippines also calculates, is the labor force divided by the adult population. So in the United States, these are the statistics. 155 million, that's a lot. Huge labor force. Unemployment rate of 6.5%. Labor force participation rate of 66.1%. Okay. So take note that labor force participation is a fraction of not total population, but adult population. So these are people who, what is labor force? Okay. So let's go back actually to this part. Employed means those who at the time of the survey worked as paid employees, worked in their own businesses, or worked as unpaid workers in the family member's business. Okay. It also includes those who were not working but had jobs from which they were temporarily absent because of vacation, illness, or bad weather. Unemployment, this category includes those who were not employed, were available for work, had tried to find employment during the previous 4 weeks. And that's the key, right? If you are available for work, tried to look for work, but were unsuccessful in finding it. It also includes those waiting to be recalled to a job from which they had been laid off. Not in the labor force means this category includes those who fit neither of the two categories. So those are full-time student, homemaker, or retiree. Those are people who don't have work and are not trying to find work. So that means they're not unemployed. They're just not in the labor force. And the idea here is that the labor participation rate is 66%. That means 34% of the adult population is not looking for work and has no work in the United States. So interesting questions about what the Philippine situation is when it comes to the labor, her labor force. So why don't we, well, we'll take a look at that. Again, I keep wanting to go to the Philippine data because looking at data is so interesting. We will do the Philippine data in the next video. Okay. So interesting graph here, 2-5, labor force participation rates. So the story in the United States is that labor force participation has been steadily rising for women. Okay. The interesting part in the Philippines is what is the labor force participation per gender? Again, that's something that you can discover because the PSA also has men versus women labor force participation rates. Okay, so now we're done and we're going to move from economic statistics to economic models. So after I do the Philippine situation in the next video, we're going to go back to GDP, we're going to go back to inflation and CPI, then we're going to go back to unemployment and talk about the Philippine case, how the Philippines calculates these things and how different or how difficult it is to calculate these things in the context of the Philippines. As practice though, why don't we, and again, this is my general advice, in my class, I'm basically just going to take questions from the end of chapter and use that as homework. So this course has homework. Every week there'll be homework, almost every week. I think there'll be at least 10, and then only the top 7 will be part of your grade. So you don't have to score very high in all of them. All right, so let's try to answer some of these questions. So the first question, super easy. Look at newspapers past few days. What new economic statistics have been released? How do you interpret these statistics? So why don't we go check out the news right now? So I'm just going to move this down here. Currently reading The Atlantic. Philippines macroeconomic news. And I'm also trying to encourage you guys to use not just the internet, but to use ChatGPT as well. In this class, we will be writing reaction essays to a few research articles or news articles. And I would like you guys to use ChatGPT to help summarize those articles and to extract insights from them. Part of the homework is to not only get whatever ChatGPT tells you after the prompt, but you should also supply as part of your homework the prompt itself. Okay, so it'll be very interesting. This will be the first time. Last quarter we didn't do this, but now let's try to do it. Integrate ChatGPT directly into your process because you should practice learning or using these free AI tools, especially habang ngayon na it's still free, right? So the Inquirer is here, Nikkei Asia, NEDA itself has news. So you can go to Inquirer, for instance. Reform sought. Which of these are macro news? So the BSP, Philippines, poised to hit GDP growth goal. Remittances. This is balance of payments. BSP to resume reserve rate cut. Talks amid easing cycle. So this will be part of monetary economics, monetary policy. Reform sought to lower Filipino households' healthcare spending. Okay, so this is pretty important. This is actually part of my research. Doing research now on Filipino households' out-of-pocket spending and debt. US stocks, Libya Central Bank, BDO online services. This is more micro, right? And also micro stories. But most of these ones, I would say that this, and then question mark this. Almost all of these are macro in nature, but definitely most of them are definitely solely macro. Yeah, so macro news are everywhere. All right, let's talk about question 2. Question 2 is all about value added, right? So in value added, we're able to calculate GDP using the value added method or the production method. Okay, so the book doesn't use the word or the terminology production method, but the Philippines does. And most statistics dealing with how GDP is actually computed does in fact use the phrase production method. Okay. Now, the farmer grows a bushel of wheat and sells it to the miller for 1. So let's go to here. This is question 2. So the farmer sells wheat for 1. That's the 1. Miller sells wheat to miller. So we want to make sure the supply chain is clear. Miller buys it and turns it into bread. Sells it for how much? 3. And then the flour pala. Flour. Sells it to the baker. Next, the baker buys it and makes bread. Sells the bread to the engineer for USD6. So what is the value added per person? So given only this information, what's the value added per person? So the farmer's value added equals 1 minus 0. 0 because we don't have any information at all about the inputs. So typically there'll be some sort of inputs here. Okay, but if this is hypothetically the start of the supply chain, then there are no purchased inputs. There are only like produced inputs. Like you make the wheat, you have the seeds and so on. Miller, VA, is 3 minus 1. Okay. Recall that he buys the wheat for 1, then sells the flour for 3. the baker, BA, is 6 minus 3. And note that the engineer has no VA because the VA for engineer is 0 because it doesn't sell. It doesn't sell. So you can add this up. 1 minus 0. Or let's just go straight. 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6 is GDP. Sum of VAs. And take note that 6 happens to be equal to the price of the bread. This is exactly what we were talking about in the notes or in the book, that this price of the final good contains the value added or the prices for all of the inputs along the supply chain. So discussion of question 3. So this is interesting. Suppose a woman marries her butler. After they are married, her husband continues to wait on her as before, and she continues to support him as before, but now as a husband rather than as an employee. How does the marriage affect GDP? Okay. So this is a fun one, and maybe we will talk about this when I get back. But one clue here is that we should recall the circular model. And what makes it the GDP is what makes GDP is both flows of goods and money or payments. Without the flow of payments, there is no GDP. And without the flow of new goods and services, I should also say new final goods, just to be final goods. Without the flow of the new final goods, there's also no GDP, right? So that's well, my clue, and then maybe we can talk about it later. Discussion of Q4, which is investment. So place each of the following transactions in one of the 4 components of expenditure: consumption, investment, government purchases, or net export. So I should say the expenditure side. So we began this particular video talking about the expenditure side. So let's do it. When Boeing sells an airplane to the Air Force, okay, the Air Force is part of the US government, and this represents consumption by the US government. Therefore, it's part of G. When Boeing sells an airplane to American Airlines, so American Airlines is a business that sells flights, and therefore, from the perspective of American Airlines, this is investment. Okay, this is capital that they use to produce flights. So this is an increase in investment. Next, Boeing sells an airplane to Air France. So notice that Air France is not in the United States. Therefore, this will be an export, specifically an export of an investment good. That's possible, okay? You can export consumption goods, non-final goods, intermediate goods, and capital goods. So that's fine. The key thing here is that Air France is not part of the United States, and therefore this is an export. Boeing sells an airplane to Amelia Earhart. So Amelia Earhart, assuming. So Amelia Earhart, the context here is that she is not a professional pilot that does, Amelia Earhart is not American Airlines. She is not, ferrying people from A to B. She is an explorer, and therefore she is buying an airplane to explore, right? This is something that she wants to spend her time on. Therefore, this is consumption. She's part of a household, and she's increased her consumption by buying a durable good, right? Again, we talked about non-durable versus durable goods. And lastly, Boeing builds an airplane to be sold next year. So if that's true, then what happens here is there's an investment, an increase in inventory investment. Okay, so that's also an increase in I, similar to how Boeing sells an airplane to American Airlines. Again, B assumes that this airplane is currently, actually A, B, C, and D, all of these assume that these are new production. This is new production of airplane. This is not coming out of inventory. If it were, then there would be no change in GDP, because what would happen is that there would be an increase in G, blah, 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 but then there would be a decrease in I, a decrease in inventory investment, as we've discussed also. So again, to complete the answer, you should explain that this airplane that's being sold by Boeing is in fact newly produced within the time frame of GDP, which is a year or a quarter. If not, then it's used goods or inventory goods, therefore has no effect on aggregate GDP for that particular time period. Interestingly enough, right now, Boeing is in the news for having substandard airplanes. There have been some accidents, a door blew out, etc. So it's kind of unfortunate. But anyway, that's where it is. All right, so the next video will be about how the Philippines does it. Again, please mind your homework. There's homework due near the end of the month, or I think first week of September, after September. Okay. Ingat and maraming salamat. Bye.